Patrick is a shining example, who think this is a medium that has a noble purpose and ability in the sphere of social change, and it ought to be deployed that way.
I would have to say that the journalists on the whole have not been as diligent in recognizing the systemic injustice that is contained in the general social attitude towards people with disabilities.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. On today's show, we'll take an in-depth look at Patrick Watson, who's chairman of the board at CBC. Watson, who has a disability, is also chairman of the board for the Canadian Abilities Foundation. Watson began his career with the CBC as a producer in 1956. He's a noted television journalist, filmmaker, writer, author, and actor. During his 35 years in broadcasting, he's been associated with some of the most memorable productions in the history of television.
Hello, I'm Dinah Christie, and I didn't come alone. Guess who brought me?
I'm Patrick Watson.
And I'm Laurie Lapierre. We must go on, and we're delighted to be here for this, our 48th edition.
This hour has 7 days.
Peter Newman writes, he should have been born a cardinal in 14th century Florence, privy councillor to the Pope, traveling the world as special envoy from the palace of the Doge.
In the early 30s, they were playing and singing a song called I'll Get By, which was pretty appropriate, really, because Canada and the rest of the world were caught in the Great Depression. And I suppose that explains partly why our parents and grandparents were so caught up in the pursuit of diversions in the form of the many fads of the period, one of which was flying the Atlantic. Hello, I'm Patrick Watson with the 5th season of the Watson Report. This is the CBC's weekly program from Ottawa, evaluating the quality of decision-making by the people that we've chosen to run the country for us here. And this season is going to be unlike any other the program's ever had because, of course, there's a whole new cast of characters.
Canadian journalist Patrick Watson has been thinking a lot about democracy. He's traveled the world, documenting the many ways majority rules. And he's found that none of us has any reason to take democracy for granted. Watson has produced a unique 10-part television series, The Struggle for Democracy. That series begins Sunday on the CBC. The idea for Watson's series was generated here in Canada by the October crisis of 1970.
As the people slept unawares, a nation's democratic rights were set aside by a stroke of the pen of the head of state.
Watson was troubled that the crisis threatened democracy. He eventually set out on a hugely ambitious project to find out what democracy is and what it means to people around the world. It took 3 years and 500,000 miles. Watson and his camera crews visited 30 countries where he talked to villagers, strongmen, children, and presidents.
You don't have any definition of your role, and I think that's dangerous.
The series shows that democracy in practice has many forms, and according to Watson, is the inevitable wave of the future.
If at first you don't succeed...
Yeah, then by rights it should be somebody else's turn.
All things come to he who waits.
My boy, I've waited with the patience of Job, and look what happens to me. I'm a guest at my fiancé's wedding.
He who hesitates is lost. Now, he also serves who only stands and waits.
A bird in the hand is worth two in the book.
Seriously, Francis, if this guy abuses you anymore, I'm very much available.
Well, the CBC can take down its help wanted signs. The corporation's top 2 positions were filled today. Prime Minister Mulroney ended the guesswork this morning by announcing a new president and, for the first time, a chairman of the board, veteran broadcast journalist Patrick Watson.
Have you ever just thought you were going to have this much fun? You've wanted this job a long time.
I've wanted versions of this job for a long time, and I had decided that that was all over a long time ago, and I think I'm about as excited as more excited than I've been since I started this Hour Has 7 Days.
During his years at CBC, Moses Znaimer, who is now president of City TV in Toronto, says he regarded Patrick Watson as a beacon of innovation. He also sees Watson as an activist and an amazingly frank person. Znaimer produced a series of television profiles called The Originals. 2 of those programs featured Watson. The first show looked at a very personal Patrick Watson, including his disability. He fell off a ladder while repairing the roof of his cottage in 1960, and his left leg was badly injured. Complications set in, and the leg was amputated.
Patrick Watson's highly successful career had just begun when an accident for which he was solely responsible caused the loss of his leg.
I don't think I have ever gotten over or will ever get over a certain degree of rage.
Over the years, in the it's now 33 years almost since I lost my leg, I have, in a quiet sort of way, made myself available to, mostly on a one-on-one basis, to people newly disabled.
When people neglect to help you, you resent their discourtesy. When they do help, you resent them for suggesting that you need help.
I made a film about the whole experience about 1.5 years or 2 years after I lost my leg.
But you
give me this and I'll through the valve hole.
And that little film's still being used as a training tool. It's called One Step at a Time, and it was made at the Montreal Rehabilitation Institute, where I got my first artificial leg, and it's about that experience.
He has first-hand knowledge of some of the critical issues that people with disabilities face. What he is able to do is he presents kind of an exquisite way of teaching people that disability doesn't have to dictate lifestyle. Disability, in fact, can be incorporated within a very productive lifestyle.
This peg leg has been to 310 feet below the surface of the ocean. Every disabled person will recognize what I'm saying. There's a sense in which you forget about it, and you just get on and do what you're doing. And people come and tap you on the shoulder and say, by the way, I notice you're disabled. And you say, oh yeah, what's that about?
You kind of have to remind yourself as you're galloping across the street in traffic that, oh yeah, I forgot. Right, that's right, that leg thing, and it's going to take him a little bit longer.
Still, there's nothing in this edition about the valor and the horror, so I guess things are looking up a little bit.
It's something that you're sort of aware of, but it doesn't in any way impede his work, and in that sense, I think he's a model exemplar. There are all kinds of people with various disabilities. Some show, some don't show, some are explicit, some are implicit. Some have that event ruin their lives, and others just deal with that the way you might deal with any number of other things.
From my point of view, getting out there in the first couple of years after the amputation, getting out there and coping with getting myself back into the work stream and accommodating to the inability to do certain things that I used to do. When we were doing the big democracy documentary project, and I was traveling a tremendous amount, I happened to be going through a period where my artificial leg was just not functioning very well, and the relationship between me and it was not a happy one. But in any case, I was having quite a lot of pain walking. And my wife and my staff kept saying to me, look, we'll arrange for wheelchairs at airports. And I was saying, no, you will not. That's the last damn thing you'll arrange for. You know, I will cope with this one way or another. Before I had my accident, I scarcely knew that the disabled community existed. So my consciousness was about as highly developed as the consciousness of the community at large. The invisibility of the disabled community was far greater than that it is now. To me, it was at that time absolutely normal to make jokes about cripples and including jokes about amputees. I can remember, in fact, being called to account by Ross McLean, who was the producer who was my mentor at the CBC, for making a joke about an amputee, or repeating an amputee joke when I was a young producer. How ironic. I have not held back from the disabilities movement. I never even thought of there being a disabilities movement. It just, it never occurred to me that I had an opportunity there to do something special until Ray came along and said, why don't you come and chair this foundation?
Well, since Patrick has become involved with the Canadian Abilities Foundation and become involved with the Abilities magazine, we've really, as a result of his presence, reached a new level of credibility.
I've never lost my love of snow. It tends to get a bit attenuated in February, but I still welcome the first snowfall of the season. Somebody else came along and said, look, you know, having done what you've done and been where you've been and being seen in the kind of prominence that you're seen in, maybe if you made a little more out of the fact that you're doing this with a disability, it would be helpful to others.
And given his knowledge of disability and his commitment to disability issues, he just serves as a role model for many, many people, whether they have a disability or not.
I don't think primarily for cosmetic reasons, but I have, like you, disguised my disability so thoroughly that despite the fact that I have not undertaken to hide it in any kind of absolute way, I've talked about it openly in interviews, but it's true. I did not like to go swimming in public places. People tend to terminate their swims a little early when I get in there. And I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. There is a humor aspect to this whole thing, and it tends to get lost because the issue is fundamentally an extremely serious issue. But like everything else that's profoundly serious in life, sex, death, birth, there's a lot of humor attached to it, and some of the most powerful humor is attached to some of the most fearful things that we have to deal with in life. And I think that those of us who are trying to make some headway in this area have to remember that humor is an important tool. And people with disabilities have to remember that. People with disabilities are, in fact, like people in all kinds of special communities, often pretty good about recognizing and deploying the humor that attaches to their situation. But if the whole, I think one of the counterproductive elements of a lot of movements is earnestness. And that if we can find ways to be, I rejoice in these crazy Cohan cartoons, for example, in the Abilities magazine, because here is a guy with a serious disability making very funny fun of people with disabilities and of that whole environment. And I think that humor is a good destabilizer in a constructive kind of way. It kind of puts people off base in a way that that allows them to recover gracefully. Let me talk about it at one particularly emotional and mythic level. I think that palpable, tangible, visible disability is, to people who do not have disabilities, far more terrifying than our normal discourse permits us to acknowledge. I think it really is seen by most people as something so awful that they really wish it would go away, because it is, by implication, something that can happen to you. And for people who have not lived with or lived with a disability or lived close to a person who has a disability, the awfulness of that disability is just beyond measure. It is in fact, in the case of amputations or paralysis, or the loss of a sense, a tangible operative metaphor for death. I don't think we've come anywhere near succeeding in spreading the kind of awareness that you and I now find relatively natural. I think the first thing is just to be very insistent and not let people get away with a casual approach to this thing. I mean, we've gone beyond the point where there's any value in being polite or tolerant.
Can't you spot the Australian?
I think that the real work is always done in small groups and at the one-on-one or one to a few or few to a one level, but that the community level activity and general media activity get a shot in the arm from something like a big conference like Independence 92, to a large extent because the people who go there and participate in it get such a sense of legitimation of what they're doing and of encouragement and of being part of a very large, in that case, global community.
Now, it seems to me that the fruitful work that we as a community have agreed to come together to do is to make that community prosper. And to make the community prosper, you have to depend on the one resource that makes a community, which is its individuals. And you therefore have to find a way to create fertile ground for those individuals to grow up upon. If we conduct our broadcasting in a way that is primarily designed to avoid risk and avoid taking chances and avoid flack, then we will not do anything that helps to wake people up. We will continue to cleave to the middle, be respectable, be solid, be liked but not loved, admired but not really sought after as a daring. You know, a good television current affairs and news operation ought to be out there a little bit like a champion on behalf of the people. The articulating of what it is we are and what we do, huge job. And the media bear a tremendous responsibility.
So that's the first thing, that we in media have to accept a responsibility to be a little more visible and get up on platforms and be a little noisy. I think that there are probably some targets there that we could be focusing on a little more diligently than we do, and those targets should be amongst the people who hold the real decision power in programming.
In the sense of being a leadership model, he is also a champion because he speaks for concern. He speaks for real Canadian decency. At least that's how I take him. And Patrick is a shining example who think this is a medium that has a noble purpose and an ability in the sphere of social change, and it ought to be deployed that way.
in the situation comedies, in the miniseries, in the ongoing program series, the Degrassis and all of their progeny, that the presence of the disabled community become more and more normalized into that. Not made a special deal of, in my judgment, but normalized in the way that has begun to happen quite effectively with the visible minorities. And people in the visible minorities community are going to say, what the hell is he talking about? It's not nearly good enough. Well, from my point of view, it's not nearly good enough, but compared with 10 or 15 years ago, the advances are terrific. They're less impressive, in my judgment, in the case of people with disabilities.
We should learn not to get it wrong in the first place so that we don't need commissions of whatever in order to force an institution to hire someone who's black or Oriental or female or whatever. If it's an issue of a workplace thing, you still have to come down to, but what's that got to do with television? Is it good television or bad television?
The basic principle of good journalism, it seems to me, is that the journalist watches out for events in society and focuses on them. And so if there are people in the community who are championing a cause and that becomes a significant event within the community, then the journalist has an obligation to go and reflect that in the journalism. I would have to say that the journalists on the whole have not been as diligent in recognizing the systemic injustice that is contained in the general social attitude towards people with disabilities. If somebody in the disabled community feels that a report that's done in the newspaper or on television or on radio about them has not spoken about them properly, it's up to them to stand up and say, wait a minute, mister, that's not my reality that you're putting out there. You invented that. You came to me with a cliche about because I'm seeking the right to die, being huddled up fearfully in the corner. That's not what I was doing. I was in fact clawing my way forward with all the energy I could bring, and you didn't see that. We all, in the image-making business, have a lot of cliches up there. And what we're doing when we go out to tell a story is, and partly this is good, partly bringing our cliches into a kind of connection with the ongoing story, because that's the way the story becomes meaningful. Well, it's up to the participants in the story to say, hey, that cliche is wrong, I got another one for you. I have a particular ambition for the Abilities Foundation, or more particularly for the Abilities Magazine as the principal expression of the Abilities Foundation, and that is to take it out of its own little sheltered workshop and bring it into the real competitive world as a freestanding, profit-making enterprise to show that the community of people with disabilities has come to the point where there's a business here in making ourselves feel better, in making ourselves more functional, and making ourselves a more visible part of society. And it's a business like any other business that can sustain itself. Any society that does not recognize the resource that's contained in its disabled people is shutting off a large part of its own capacity to be economically viable and, in fact, to be socially and spiritually a healthy society.
As Patrick Watson said, he's always made an effort to assist others with disabilities on a one-to-one basis. That commitment has evolved to encompass a broader community, as reflected in his contribution to the Abilities Foundation. Many others with disabilities are also recognizing that through sharing experiences and resources, much more can be achieved to heighten awareness. That's our show. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. Now, here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.